Well, hello and welcome everyone who's tuned in to watch this Keynote Roundtable on the transition movement, past, present, and future, with Rob Hopkins, co-founder of the International Transition Towns Movement, and Sarah McAdam, Delivery Director for Transition Network. My name is Don Hall, and I'm the co-director of Transition US. It seems appropriate now that we're a full decade into the transition movement here in this country and about 13 years internationally, that we take time to step back and celebrate some of the great successes that this movement has had over that time. And also reflect on some of the challenges that are facing our transition movement today, and to look forward to key themes that are emerging right now in the transition movement and will be important to pay attention to moving forward. Since the first official transition initiative in the world, Transition Town Totnes, was founded in September of 2006, this movement has spread around the world to approximately 1,200 communities in 50 countries, including 164 official transition initiatives located in 38 states here in the US, including Transition Town Glassboro, that recently became the 164th official transition initiative in the US. So congratulations, Glassboro. These initiatives have revitalized their local food systems, strengthened their local economies, reduced their dependence on fossil fuels, and patiently mended the torn fabric of their local communities. Although this transition journey has not been without its challenges and setbacks, I believe that transitioners around the world and here in the US should be exceedingly proud of all that we have accomplished thus far. Nevertheless, the issues that the Transition Towns movement initially came together to address, such as resource depletion, climate change, and economic instability, have never been more urgent. And so I believe personally that these times are calling us to think about how we can broaden, deepen, and scale up our impacts moving forward. I'm very happy to have here two of the most profound thinkers, dare I say, about this topic in the transition movement to start this conversation. And this is really just a beginning. I hope that you all follow up on some of the themes that we talk about here today in your local watch parties for this event, in our live stream, and in various ways in your local initiatives, regional hubs, national working groups, through organizations like Transition US and Transition Network in the months and years to come. What inspires and excites you about how the transition movement has developed since its beginning?
Well, I guess the important thing to start with is to say that when we started transition here in Totnes 2005, 2006, as you said, we really had no idea that anyone was even going to be interested here. Never mind, we were trying to design something that might interest some people here in this little town in the southwest of England. And the unleashing event that we had here, already there were people, I don't even know how they heard about it, who were there from different places, who then went off and started it where they were. And then other people heard about it. And it had this kind of life. And sometimes people come and talk to us about it and imagine that somehow we planned this kind of stealthy thing that was going to be, that was going to, and it really wasn't like that. Mm-hmm. So for me, one of the exciting things has been that it has been constantly surprising and intriguing and fascinating and inspiring. And I remember the day sitting here after about 3 years where Ben, my colleague here, Ben Brangwyn, said, "We've just had an email from Iran. There's some people who want to start transition in this city in Iran." And there was something that really felt like, we when we thought about how best to support this, before it was even a movement, this kind of intention, or this kind of dynamic that felt like it was starting to move through us, and we tried to put around it that what does this need in order to self-organize? What does this need? What kind of support does it need just to find its own shape and to develop that kind of momentum? The thing that's been most exciting for me is just to see that happening, to see it kind of grow and spread and find its own shape, and that when it lands in a new place, whether it's Brazil or Chile or Korea, you know, that it finds its own identity, it finds its own voice, it finds its own way of manifesting whatever that kind of intention is, but it's still kind of recognizably transition. There's something that I find really, really fascinating about that. And there was a guy called Luigi Russi, who, there's lots of researchers who research transition, and a lot of what they produce isn't necessarily that useful. He came here to Totnes for a year, and he just stayed here for a year, and he went to everything. Every meeting you went to, he was there. Every event you went to, he was putting away the chairs and cleaning the teacups, and just went to everything. And he wrote a thing called Everything Gardens that was his reflections on that. And he said, I like to think not so much of the transition movement, but of the transition moving. That actually what's been most fascinating to observe over the last 12 years has been how it has adapted and changed. And, you know, when we publish different books, we tried at that moment to say, transition kind of looks like this. And we'll come on to talk more about that later on, you know, but actually for me, what's most fascinating is how it encounters blockages and resistance, how it absorbs new ideas and how it changes and adapts. And that kind of permission or kind of inbuilt ability to do that, I think is really, really fascinating. I've been really excited to see how that self-organizing idea, where it goes and who you meet, people who are often in positions of power or in organizations who are really, really excited about transition and say, you know, when I started working here in the mayor's office, I was the only person with the transition handbook and everyone thought I was mad. Now everybody has a copy. You know, there's that sort of sense that there's something in there, that wherever you are, there's something that really excites people. I've always found it really exciting going to visit different places where transition's happening. I think in lots of ways, transition is kind of a network of stories. We always say, you know, the resources are free, get involved, be part of this network. The main commitment is that you share your stories back into the movement, what works, what doesn't work, how it all went. And as one of the main people in Transition Network, whose role has been to find those stories and share those stories like you're doing so beautifully with your 10 stories of transition in the US. I love those stories of people trying things and seeing what happens. So for me, I love going to visit places and seeing what people are doing, hearing their stories. That's the kind of the crackle, the sort of frisson in transition that I really love, is kind of hearing those stories. And I love, and we're going to talk a bit, I think, about imagination later, but I love going to places that have come up with really good what-if questions. When they come up with a question that then opens up in turn loads of other possibilities. You know, it felt to me like the last 50 years, that move towards Amazon controlling half of everything that's sold online, and supermarkets, and that monoculture, that shift in that direction has been a shutting down of possibility and imagination. And when you see it start to go the other way, and how when you start to push in the other direction and you start your local economy going again and you bring in new elements, how that then opens up other possibilities. I love seeing that. And I think maybe the main thing that's exciting is that we're still here, actually. You know, after 12 years, you know, there's so many movements that come like a souffle and they go whoosh, and then they kind of go again. But the fact that the transition movement has designed for you know, is still going, it still has momentum, and is still seen as one of the key, I suppose, ideas on the table when we look at what the future might be like, is something that I find really, really exciting.
Yeah, I'd love to invite your reflections on the same question, Sarah. What inspires and excites you, and particularly if you do have any stories of transition initiatives that have really stuck out as being particularly exciting or inspiring?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to mention that has inspired me and touched me has been the evidence that transition initiatives build resilience that can be of real value at times of crisis. And some of the examples I've seen of that, and there are more than these, I've seen and heard stories about what happened in New Zealand after the earthquakes, in Japan after the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and in Italy in response to the earthquakes there. And in all those places and in others, we've seen transition groups and people involved in transition. They've got the cohesion and the connections already in place. There's something about, they have a sense of agency and a sense that they don't need to wait for permission. You know, if they see a need, they feel empowered to act and capable of acting, and they've got the skills to respond in some really positive ways. So, just some examples. We've seen transition groups get portable solar-powered generators to villages that have lost electricity. We've seen them mobilise to find temporary accommodation for people who have lost their homes. And we've seen them do some more subtle things, creating space and processes for people to express their feelings about what has happened, and come together, and when the time is right, to start to dream about, well, where do they go from here, from a place of great loss, how do they actually translate that into what they want next for their town or their village. So that really touches and inspires me in terms of the sort of invisible capital that transition can create in a place.
Yeah, I know that's a major theme that's emerging here in the US: emergency preparedness, response and recovery. And, we are seeing more and more so-called natural disasters supercharged by climate change. And I'm wondering, beside those kind of challenges, those challenges that are, associated with climate change or resource depletion or economic instability, what are the biggest challenges that you're seeing that are currently faced by transition groups in trying to have an impact and influence positive change?
Well, these are tough times for lots of people, and what I see and what I hear when I talk to transitioners all over the world, a repeated message is groups and individuals not feeling adequately resourced to respond to the scale of the challenge we're facing. And when I talk about resources, I'm talking about emotional resources, physically and financially. And we see that showing up across the movement in different ways. It can show up as burnout, as sort of feelings of overwhelm. We see people dropping out and groups losing energy and momentum. And you can also see groups becoming quite entrenched and maybe a bit embattled, feeling that pressure of what they're trying to do. And actually a group that's in that sort of state can find it really hard to attract new people and engage with what's changing and happening in their own community. It's very difficult from that place to go out and bring new people in. So there's something, there is a real theme for me here around how we, all of us, how we acknowledge and face the scale and the urgency of the change that's needed, without finding ourselves being driven and driving others from a place of fear and anxiety, and that pressure that I can, I feel myself and I see in others, that pressure of, is what we're doing good enough? And if it won't be enough, what does that mean? So when I look around, for me, the most thriving groups, and all groups, I should say, all transition groups go through times of momentum and vibrancy, and times when things feel a little tired and a little hard going. That's the reality of life. But the ones that feel most sort of thriving and resilient to me do pay some attention to self-care, to looking after themselves individually and looking after the group, to creating good processes, to making sure there's space for celebration and reflection and rest, and listening to feedback, hearing how what they're doing is working and what's changing around them, as well as that dynamic creative action that can be so exciting. It's that balance and flow between the action and reflection that for me feels actually even more important at this time when everything can feel so frightening.
I think for me, some of the challenges that I hear coming up from groups I visit are, should we run for government? Should we take that step across and say we want to become our local representatives, because the people who are there at the moment, really, we couldn't do any worse. And actually, we're coming in with the ideas and the enthusiasm of the community. I think there's really interesting questions about, do we have the skills and the way of seeing within the transition movement that we need in order to be kind of building the new economic infrastructures that we need. Often the people who are attracted to transition aren't necessarily the same sort of people who are really great at setting up viable businesses and that kind of thing. So there's that, bringing that side into it. And when you see that, it's really, really exciting. I think there's a question about when is something transition and when isn't it? I know we have here in Totnes, sometimes there are projects we're involved in, they aren't called a transition project. That sort of developing those really skillful ways of how you work with your community, I think, are really, really important. And keeping your transition group as seen as being non-politically aligned is kind of a bit of a struggle, because people like to say, oh, you're Greens or you're Progressive or this, that and the other. For me, the most skillful thing is finding a way through the middle where you don't pick any of that up. But I think fundamentally the main challenge that I see in transition groups is keeping that momentum going. You have a group of people who are tired, who are stretched, who are pulled in different directions. People go off and they get a job, or they have a baby, or actually how do we keep momentum and bring new people in and have something that feels like an invitation to new people coming in all the time?
So obviously there's lots of key themes and patterns for running a healthy transition initiative. Like Sarah and Rob, you both talked about finding balance and self-care. And also, as you mentioned at the outset, Rob, that every transition initiative is different and unique. And that's part of the beauty of transition, is that it adapts and embraces the particularities of its place. So I'm wondering, can we say that there is a transition model that can point the way for people who are just starting out with transition, or people who are experienced in transition? How do we continue to level up over time? And I'll start this question with Rob, since you've done so much work on this in the past.
So when we started, and we were really making it up on the hoof as we were going along, and people said, what is it? How do you do it? How do you do transition? What's the model? What's the model? And so to start with, we in the transition handbook, we had the 12 steps, because that was there were kind of different things we were doing, and there were 12 of them, and maybe they went in a sequence, and we thought that sounded quite good. And then and after a couple of years, we noticed that people were starting to talk about the 12 steps of transition as though they were carved in slabs of stone and had been carried down a mountain by a man with a very long white beard. And so our natural tendency was then to tear it up and look at it again. Also, it didn't really work like that. So then we started to look at it and say, actually, maybe transition, the invitation is more like the invitation to initiative to make the most amazing cake you can imagine. Everybody has different there's different stages that are always consistent, but there's different ingredients. And we went out to the transition movement and said, rather than us saying this is what transition is, we said, what are you doing? And so from that we developed all these different ingredients. It was called the transition companion. And the thing I loved about that as a model was, firstly, that each of those ingredients was not something that was created by an academic sat in a book-lined office somewhere. Each of those ingredients was something we'd observed and then asked people about, and it kind of emerged from a living, self-organizing experiment. That was something I really liked about that. And that it sort of set them out into 5 different stages, which gave a sense of, yes, at the moment you're here, but actually maybe it could go here and maybe it could go here. And the cards that we made out of those, a bit like sort of like transition tarot cards, I've done those with a lot of groups where you can use them to lay them out and tell your story. First we did this, and we did this. You can use them to give people a sense of what transition is very, very quickly, and I really like those. Then we created something called the 7 essential ingredients of transition, which are what do you need to get started. Well, here's your starter kit. These are the things you need to really think about. How do you create a healthy group? How do you create projects that are going to work, with lots of different stories. So I think in terms of now in 2018, what's the transition model? I think this is a really useful point to kind of review that again and say, well, these are the models we've done so far. As somebody who when I did my permaculture course, and as soon as someone gave me a copy of A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, I was never the same again. And for me, the transition companion is like a transition pattern language, which can be constantly revised and changed and tweaked and new things brought in, and it's very fluid and flexible. But that, I like that because that's kind of the way that my brain works, but I appreciate it might not be how everybody else's brain works. But I think this is a really useful point, again, to go back to the movement and say, okay, what do those ingredients look like? Are they even ingredients? But for me, every one of those stages where we've stopped and said, yeah, what is this thing actually? What does it look like? How does it work? Has been a really, really valuable process. And certainly doing the companion and being able to kind of dip into the movement and hear everybody's stories and gather together all of that wisdom. And, you talked about the collective genius, and there was that lovely sense of bringing all of that in, which I think really enriches the movement, and one of the things that excites me most about it.
And Sarah, I'd also love to hear your reflections on how we describe what transition is and how it works, and what's the future of the transition model.
Well, actually, I really agree with what Rob's just said, that I think this is the time for a more collective reflection about exactly that. I don't think I know the answer to that right now. I'm hearing feedback from lots of different places and lots of different people. I'm hearing a lot of appetite to have this conversation, and I'm hearing anecdotes. So, I'm hearing about things like, I'm hearing people moving beyond working at a community level, taking transition processes and ideas into all sorts of places, universities, different levels of government, businesses, other parts of civil society. I'm hearing that, and that feels interesting. And there's a sort of question of, well, does that carry on being transition, and how do we all, how do people organise that sort of activity? I'm hearing a lot around the sort of power to convene becoming important. I mean, it's a related issue that actually some of the skills that and the it's not just the skills, it's the sort of value and the heart that transition groups can bring to a process, is that they can bring a really sort of broad group of people together, and with skillful process, they can help them to put aside their sort of professional hats or their sort of political loyalties, and really think, as human beings coming together to think about how to make this place more healthy, more happy, more resilient. What do we want to do together? And one particular example of that I really must mention is the Municipalities in Transition project, because that feels really exciting to me. This is an international project that is only just at an early stage, but which is trying to identify and gather evidence from places where you see really engaged groups of citizens, transition groups or others, working with a municipality, local government, who are open to doing something different, and in some cases desperate to do something different because what they have been doing is clearly not working. And I think there's some really interesting experience out there. And we're running some pilots in 5 different countries at the moment, and gathering in their experience as well, and trying to create a community of practice of people working like this all over the world. So for me, it's a key time for us to actually revisit the model and revisit that question of where, where is transition now and where is it going? And actually, that's one of the questions for our organisation, Transition Network, but working with others, with Transition US and others. How can we make that conversation as broad and rich as possible and bring in different voices?
And I just want to mention municipalitiesintransition.org. Really great resource to check out. Very inspiring reading all the case studies there. So great work on that Municipalities in Transition team. I think we've identified a number of themes that are emerging, such as emergency preparedness and working with local governments, more attention to the inner and interpersonal aspects of transition.
I just do want to mention one more, if you'll allow me to, Don, if that's not too...
Absolutely.
I think this an issue that I see lots of groups grappling with, in a world, politics is very different in different places, but a world where, the rise of the extreme right, a politics which is based on splitting us from each other, and creating disconnection. I see a real need, and I see some groups that are doing some really interesting work around social justice, around connecting with the most marginalised in our society, and connecting across distance to the people that are already feeling the impacts of climate change in a very, very real and terrifying way. And that bit of really helping social justice to sort of shine within our movement. I mean, for me, that's another really important theme.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say, I think maybe if we look back to the very early days of transition, there was a sense of what this place needs is, there was a sense that, that transition groups would come with ideas of projects and a sense that, this place needs to cut its carbon footprint and reimagine its economy. And we had a sense of what the needs are. I think the last few years has been much more that sense of what are the needs of this place actually, and how can we do transition in such a way that we can try and meet those needs, do transition by meeting those needs. So here in Totnes now, we've 2 projects that have come through transition, which together are going to build over 100 homes that are truly affordable for local people, providing more and more opportunities for people to invest rather than in the bank, but to invest into the place. Looking at providing care and supporting, bringing together all those different organizations that provide care to work in a different way, again, to meet those needs, and working around food and helping people on low incomes access good food. So we're still doing transition with the same motivation and the same sort of kind of end point, but rather than saying, we as a group know what this place needs, we're going to do that, there's a real more sort of humble bit for me of saying, what does this place need? What is this place telling us that it needs?
So, looking at these different emerging themes, I've been a big fan of the Transition Companion for a number of years now, probably since it came out. And I think it's something that's often been overlooked in the movement, perhaps due to some of the complexity of the model. And although I found the specific ingredients very valuable, what I found most valuable was the way that you laid them out into stages, Rob, into the starting out stage where we are coming together as a group. We are starting to build a base of support through raising awareness and bringing the early adopters together, harnessing the creativity of the people that show up to then try out a bunch of things, start some small projects and see what really sticks, what resonates with the community, what we can do really well. And then at some point really focusing in on what's working and building an organization and working more on our internal group process to be able to do some larger projects in the community and build a kind of sense of acceptance in the broader community that then opens the door to a connecting phase where we can then reach beyond the early adopters to collaborate with local governments and local businesses and other key institutions in our community to really get the word out in a much broader way via local media. And then that bringing in more resources, more support, more people, more ideas, more expertise to do some of the biggest projects that transition does, like renewable energy cooperatives or alternative currencies or energy descent plans that are very difficult to do at the outset when you have an all-volunteer group and you have no money and you haven't gone through this refinement process of figuring out where our strengths lie and what our community most needs. And my observations here in the US are that we have great examples of initiatives in all of those first 4 stages, and I think maybe even more so around the world. But a lot of initiatives find themselves stuck in the starting out stage. That the same people kind of keep showing up to the meetings and keep doing the same kind of things. And as a result, there's that loss of momentum. There seems to need to be a forward momentum that we're actually going somewhere with this for people to stay interested and engaged. So sometimes people drop off and groups end up disbanding. Because of that, because there isn't a kind of an ability to evolve and shift into the next phase. And I think that's very similar to what we're experiencing on the national level right now, where we've done some really great work laying the foundation and bringing together lots of people that care about transition and community resilience building and are concerned about climate change and resource depletion and economic instability. But it's still been a very kind of limited group. We don't see transition stories on the national media. We don't hear this talked about in the political sphere. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to scale up. And that's, I see that in 3 dimensions: broadening, deepening, and scaling up. So we're reaching and including more people. We're going deeper with our commitment and with our understanding of the transition process and the challenges that we're facing, and we're able to do bigger and bigger things over time. And I'm wondering, that's our experience here in the US, or at least my experience, my observations. And I'm wondering if that resonates with what you're seeing internationally, and if you have any thoughts about that for us doing transition work here in the States.
Certainly, that description of groups that feel stuck at an early stage and can feel sort of exhausted and stuck. So there is, that's one of the reasons, for example, that Transition Network, we've been talking about the value of groups doing what we call a health check process, and it's one of the resources that we share on our website to actually create a real moment of reflection for a group. So rather than this sense of, well, we're just, keeping going with what we're doing, to actually step back and give yourself space to look at what you have achieved, because often there will, when groups start then thinking about their history and what they've done, they surprise themselves with what's happened, but also to just see the gaps. What are we doing well, but also what have we not paid attention to, and how might we do that differently. So there's something for me there that feels valuable. The other thing I would say, I completely agree with you that the ingredients feel vibrant and interesting still to me. I'm sure there's more ingredients now out there in the world. I'm not so convinced by this. I feel like things have shifted around the stages, and certainly I don't think it's always helpful to present it as this sort of, and I'm not sure you were presenting it like this, Don, but as a clear progression. These are sort of steps that lead us somewhere, because I think it's more complex than that. And the groups that I see thriving are groups that have got the flexibility in their decision making and their approach that lets them respond to what emerges. And there's something for me about opening ourselves up at this moment in time, that actually this is not the time, I don't think personally, for us to be saying this, what do we do as transition? How do we strengthen the model and keep some sort of purity around transition? This is all, for me, at this time of challenge, this is about opening ourselves up, really, as Rob was saying, really listening to what's going on in our community, what the needs are in our community, rather than sitting in a small group and determining those, seeing where the energy is and how we can get alongside it and support it. And actually, I think about that at every level of scale, nationally, internationally. I've been doing some work recently with the European Union, and that sort of sense of, you don't come in telling them what to do, you come in alongside them to say, what are you worried about? This is what we're worried about. How, what are you interested in? How can we help you? And that is a so much more interesting way to work. And I think the only way, this is all about collaboration at this point, collaboration beyond the movement, making links, surprising links as well, not just to the usual suspects, but the links to, and I don't necessarily know the equivalents in the US, but to the labour movement, in the UK, I think of the Women's Institute, all the different organisations, faith groups, all the different places where people gather together and think about, how, is the world how we want it? That's the place where we need to be, supporting them to have that conversation.
So I'm currently researching a book to come out next year, which is about imagination. And I was just yesterday up in Dundee for the day, way up in Scotland, visiting an amazing project called Art Angel, which is about working with people with mental health problems, people who are kind of the people who are falling through the cracks of this kind of neoliberal austerity, cutting everything agenda, and who are just left behind, and using art, whether it's photography or painting or drawing, whatever, as a way of bringing people back in again. And I did a round table with some of their trustees and with some of the people who've come through. They don't call them patients or clients, they call them artists. If you come, you're an artist, and you're working on your work, and you're an artist and respected as such. And the guy who was on the trustees, he said, fundamentally what we're about here is about safety and hope. And he said the two things that people need most at this time is safety and hope. And so for me, if that's the kind of the foundation that what we try and do. It felt to me like from the beginning, actually, to create spaces where people come in, they feel safe, they can bring their imagination, they can bring their sense of hope. They don't need to sit on their own at home feeling bleak and feeling like everything is lost. They can come together, they can share that, they can meet other people, they can find something they can do to turn that into something practical. And it might take a while, it might be something that clicks immediately. But there was something that really, really touched me about that thing of saying this is about safety and hope. He said that's not even written in any of our documents, but it's fundamentally what runs through what we do. It's about safety and hope. And I think if after 12 years we can look at it and say that it's providing spaces where anybody can come and they can find safety and they can find hope, then that's a really powerful foundation for what lies ahead for us all, I think.
If there's anything you'd like to say to everybody who's out there watching to encourage us to keep going and inspire those who have not yet started to get involved?
I think I would say that when you do transition, you can feel like, you know, here's how big all the challenges are we're facing is, and here's the thing that you're doing, and it's absolutely tiny, doesn't make any difference. And the thing that I've seen again and again in transition is about where the tipping points are, and you never know where they are. And you start a project, and you start it with a good heart and feeling this is what these times are calling me to do, and I'm stepping up and we're creating this project and I'm working with other people, and you create that, but you never know when you start that project who's going to see it, who's going to be moved by it, where that story is going to go, who it's going to influence, who it's going to affect. And you know, there's a city in Belgium called Liège who started a project 4 years ago. The transition group was Centre Alimentaire, which means food belt, had this big what if question. What if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in the city came from the land around the city? I went back 4 years later. They've started 14 cooperatives, raised €5 million from local people. And the mayor said, this is now the story of this city. You know, but it came just from that initial people sitting around having a conversation, where might this go? So for me, I would always say to people, when you start, firstly, you have no idea where it's going to go, and just see what happens. And another thing I would say is just the most deepest and most profound gratitude to everybody in the US over the last 12 years who was given any time and love and care and attention to nurturing this and to kindling this. And you know, believe me, the work that's happening in the US is being watched and celebrated and talked about all over the world by many, many people who would similarly wish to bring that gratitude to and express that gratitude right now.
Yeah, I wanted to add to Rob's thanks. I mean, that's where I start from, is real appreciation for everybody who's involved and for the work they're doing, however small or big or lengthy or short. You know, the contributions that of each individual are really important. I wanted to say that, I mean, for me, to be able to do that work in our communities with our neighbours, but to feel the power of being linked across the world, you know, is something that never fails to move me. You know, the sense of connection. And when I, you know, can speak like this to somebody thousands of miles away, and know that we, you know, we have the same values, we're working for change in the same way, that actually, you know, that's what excites me. And there's something about, you know, sitting with uncertainty. This isn't about we've got a roadmap. This isn't about we know where we're going. Let's not kid ourselves about that. There's something about sitting comfortably in uncertainty. And if I'm going to do that, then I do that best by connecting with others who see the world, see the need for change as I do, and, you know, and are my allies. So thank you.
Thank you both. And just by way of closing, I would say, you know, don't stop daring to dream. That, you know, not just the capital T transition movement, but all our allies out there in the permaculture movement and local food, local economy, local energy movements, all the people out there working for a better world, that our actions, that our impacts really do add up. And that, you know, even in this time when it seems impossible that we could actually make a change, that we could actually realize the transition vision of truly resilient and relocalized communities all over the world, that I think that the winds of history are blowing at our back here. And the most important thing is that we get started and that we make an ongoing commitment to this work that's so badly needed in our world right now. And also to invite everybody, you know, if this is your first connection with Transition US and the Transition Towns movement, just invite you to get involved. And probably the easiest way is just to go to our website, transitionus.org, and check out all the great programs and tools and trainings and how-to guides and inspiring stories and national working groups, volunteer opportunities, so many different ways that you can get involved. And we'd love to have you. So thanks again to Rob and Sarah for this wonderful conversation, and thanks to all of you for listening in.
Thank you.